Outside of Intel processors, there are several manufacturers that were trying to compete with the Pentium lineups. In this case, we are talking about the Socket 7 architecture, which is the successor to Socket 5, which started out with the Pentium 75MHz up to 133MHz. However, the only difference between the two socket types is that Socket 7 features an extra pin, and also allows dual split rail voltages. If you were wondering why there are two Socket 7 types in 86box and emulator, now you know why. Now, because there weren't too many changes, you could still pretty much use Socket 5 processors on a Socket 7 motherboard. Later on, Intel was shifting away from Socket 7 in favor of Slot 1 for their Pentium 2 and Pentium 3 lineups. But by that point, Slot 1 turned out to be more brief and ended up being replaced by Socket 370 and then Socket 423 later on. But that's not what we're going to talk about. In this video, we are going to talk about one of Intel's rivals, AMD, as they introduced the Super Socket 7 architecture. This was a response to Intel dropping Socket 7 in favor of Slot 1, which of course left AMD with an outdated platform to work on. They came up with the Super Socket 7 architecture as a stopgap, while they were developing their own Slot 1 equivalent, Slot A, for their upcoming Athlon processors to compete with the Intel Pentium 3 lineup. Beforehand, AMD had introduced the AMD K6 prior, which was a regular Socket 7 processor lineup marketed to be on par with the Intel Pentium 2, with just a significantly lower price. This gave Intel some serious competition due to the impact AMD brought into the PC market. As for Super Socket 7, they were designed for AMD K6-2 processors in mind, as not only these motherboards brought in AGP support, Super Socket 7 allows a maximum 100MHz frontside bus. Think of it like Socket 7 but on steroids, and I happen to own not one, but two custom-built machines with these motherboards on hand. Though one of the motherboards was confirmed to be from PC chips, judging from the burn-in 24-hour AMI BIOS chip. Based on what I've heard, PC chips motherboards weren't the greatest kind of motherboards in the market, due to its cheaply built nature. However, I will still put this motherboard to the test in the future one day. Funny enough, this PC chip's motherboard has some rather obscure integrated PCI audio chip, and integrated SIS graphics. However, this board lacks an AGP bus, so you're kinda limited on what video cards you could use. Now, I wasn't able to test their capabilities, because while one of the AT power supplies on the other machine worked, the other machine that had the PC chip's motherboard started to crap out after a little while. It didn't show signs of life except for one time, so I kinda knew either the motherboard or the power supply was starting to show that it's on its way out. Anyway, the integrated SIS chipset lacking AGP bus is a similar case with the Dell Optiplex GX110, which has the Intel i810E chipset taking over the AGP bus. Of course, the working machine, however, uses a motherboard from DFI, which has an AGP bus, and I actually have more AGP cards than I do PCI cards. So it's time to swap out the 8MB SIS video card with a Diamond Viper V550, which is basically an OEM variant of the NVIDIA RIVA TNT, just for decent DirectX and OpenGL support. But don't worry, I will make a video about the SIS card on another time. My plans, however, is to rebuild both of these machines. One as a fast AMD K6-2 machine meant for Windows 98, and the other as a slower machine meant for Windows 95. I will discuss this motive behind that in a moment. Admittedly, I do really like the look of these generic AT computer cases, and say what you will about OEM manufacturers, especially Acer and HP, trying to come up with these wacky designs. But I feel like these so-called boring boxes do have a charm to it, just like the fancy looking OEM cases and chassis and whatnot. Well, maybe except for some of the HP Pavilion machines that came out in the mid-90s, like seriously. These machines just look really bloated. It just really isn't for me if I'm being honest, but some might like it actually. The processor inside is an AMD K6-2 350 MHz, which might sound interesting, but looking at charts from CPU World, it's about as on par with the 266 MHz Pentium 2 in integer performance, whereas in floating point performance it surpasses the Intel Celeron 300A just by a bit. We are talking about an outdated architecture that is being pushed to its limits, so the fact that it can compete against the newer Pentium 2 is quite an achievement. But once you upgrade to a 550 MHz variant, which I believe is the fastest AMD K6-2 processor around, it is pretty much on par with the Intel Pentium 2 clocked at 350 MHz in integer performance. The other machine that had the PC chip's motherboard happens to have one of these 550 MHz processors, so I plan to try this out on a follow-up video. But for now, I do want to see what the 350 MHz processor is capable of. I had originally intended to install Windows 95 on this machine, but however, I ran into some major hurdles, especially with the AGP controller. You see, the motherboard has a VIA chipset, and even when I installed the chipset drivers, I am met with some bizarre conflicts. I even tried the latest chipset drivers in an attempt to fix this issue to no avail. I may end up revisiting it one day because there's a chance that some of the older versions of the chipset driver may or may not work on this motherboard. On top of this, I had to underclock the machine a bit as I was getting protection errors. I recall a patch for this exists at the time, but nowadays you could get away with just using patch 9X, which allows faster processors to run Windows 9X with little to no issues. Up next, I attempted to install Windows 98 2nd Edition, and honestly, I think it would have been a better choice for NVIDIA video cards, considering cards like these tend to visually bug out in certain games like Unreal. Though I do have my Pentium 2 with a Voodoo 2 card for that purpose. This is mainly because of games like Unreal being designed for both software and 3D effects in mind. So of fucking course support for Direct3D and OpenGL are nothing but an afterthought. It was only until faster computers became more available to consumers that games like these can be played more smoothly, considering how these renderers work differently compared to the Glide API. To finish what I'm pointing out before getting back to talking about operating systems, I will end by saying that 3D effects cards aren't really necessary to have. They are nice when given the chance to get your hands on a card or two, but thanks to the existence of glide wrappers like nGlide and DG Voodoo, you could kind of get away with just playing these games under glide just by using a faster Pentium 3 or a Pentium 4 machine and a DirectX 9 compliant graphics card. Unless you're aiming to play a game that requires these APIs, or unless you are aiming to play games on more period accurate hardware, you really don't need a 3D effects card. Anyways, during the install of Windows 98 2nd Edition, I was met with a bizarre error regarding sysdm.cpl, which appears to be part of the control panel, which is really weird. And clicking out of this error pretty much locks up the installation process. I tried to troubleshoot the issue by seeing if it's a RAM issue, but the RAM seems to be fine. In the end, I decided to say screw it and installed Windows Millennium Edition. To be honest, I never really intended this machine to use this operating system, as I really prefer using that on a Pentium 3, just like my childhood PC back then. Well, maybe aside from making content about Windows Millennium Edition, but either way, Windows Millennium Edition does have a working chipset driver out of the box, so that's a plus. That's when I realized the strong points between the three operating systems. Windows 95 is more minimalized, but has certain issues with stability from time to time. Windows 98 2nd edition, well, we're excluding the 1st edition of fucking course, while a little bit heavy due to its integration with Internet Explorer, it was the most compatible with software for a while. Windows Millennium Edition, however, is more designed for convenience by packing features and drivers out of the box, but it has its own set of compatibility issues, especially since the lack of MS-DOS mode. But this was during a time period when Microsoft was shifting away from the 9X kernel in favor of the Windows NT kernel, especially since the kernel was getting more fleshed out, and more capable and affordable machines started to hit the market. OEM manufacturers like Dell and HP were a great example of this. Almost $700 was enough to get you an Intel Celeron PC in November 2000. Now you may be wondering what games I ended up trying on this machine. Here we have Postal by Running with Scissors, but for some bizarre reason the music managed to lag and slow itself down once I went to the main menu. Music to my ears, by the way. Whoa, what the? Now this is even more creepier. But other than that, the performance is about as decent by 1998 standards, and the level Parade of Disasters is a great example of this. Now, when I usually test 3D games on machines like these, I usually talk about Unreal. Especially now that I mentioned Unreal on this video. I went ahead and tried Unreal Tournament in Direct 3D. The performance honestly is pretty rough. It even got to a point that I had to lower the game's resolution to 320 by 200. This is the main disadvantage I was talking about, especially for games like these. Though it doesn't help that both Unreal and Unreal Tournament are CPU intensive games. Once you pit yourself against somebody using a higher end gaming machine, you are really going to have a hard time getting on top of the scoreboard. This was usually the case when I pitted myself against human players on my Uncanny Compact machine, which with the Pentium 2 300MHz and the Rage LT Pro doing most of the heavy work. Even I was struggling, especially on more larger and more detailed maps. I believe it got to a point where I reduced the settings to mild success. But maybe that was just me being spoiled because I was playing these games on faster machines that achieved 60 plus frames per second. Not to mention that using a ball mouse made me play even more rusty. I do need to buy myself an optical mouse for these machines, really. Now, it's no problem if you're able to adjust to it, especially by late 90s standards, where even 15 frames per second was considered acceptable. There have been stories about people completing video games on lower end hardware, because that's all they had. Given the times where faster PCs were crazy expensive, this says a lot about my earlier statement about 3D effects cards. You just had a choice between adjusting to the not so smooth performance or investing on a 3D accelerator card. In the case of this machine, however, they were meant for the average budget user, who couldn't afford a Pentium MMX back in the day, and couldn't afford a Pentium 2 now. These processors stand at the middle between the two processors, and that was why the AMD K6-2 was kind of a big deal back then. The K6-2 does have its own 3D extension named 3D Now, but I don't know too much about it aside from a Quake 2 patch, so that could be for another video. As for Windows Millennium Edition and MS-DOS games, that was where I started to have some more weirder issues, especially with Blood from 1997, where the sound system would bug out and no sound would play anymore until I restarted the entire machine due to a DMA conflict. Though I am not too sure if it was a driver problem, an operating system problem, or even the problem with the sound card itself. Anyways, I do plan to make a follow-up video once I get both of these machines situated, but for now I think this should be it for this video. What are your thoughts on the AMD K6-2 processor? Was it a worthy competitor to Intel's Pentium 2 lineup? I would like to know about that in the comment section down below, and as always, see you later and peace out everybody. Bye for now.